Singapore and to be with you, to talk with you today. It's particularly wonderful because, of course, people always say that Singapore is a crossroads of cultures and communities, and school, too, is often a crossroads of cultures and communities. And when we come to school, when we go to school, all of us have to traverse some social distance. We all have to leave behind the communities and families that we have been with, that we have grown up with, perhaps, and come to a new space, a space with lots of different people, often lots of different people with different backgrounds. When we do that, we can often wonder what that world will be like, what that community will be like, how we're going to fit into that community, whether we'll be able to build relationships in that community, whether we'll be able to grow and become the kind of person that we want to be within that world. I thought I would just begin a little bit by telling a rather silly personal story, which is my own experience going to college. So I was brought up in Michigan, which is in the Midwest and is a cold but wonderful place. And I went to Stanford in California as a college student in the fall of 1996. And when I went to California, it was pretty salient to me that this was California. Somehow it felt like a long, long ways from Michigan, even though my father was brought up in California, even though I'd been in California many times. It felt very different. And I thought, what is it going to be like to be here with all these people in California? It was the worry that I had. And then one day, early on, like the first few months of college, there showed up on campus, in the middle of the campus, in the most central place, a truck from the burger company In-N-Out, which is a California burger company. It's mostly in California, some elsewhere in the West, but certainly not, from my perspective, in Michigan. I'd never heard of this company before, In-N-Out. And I, then saw all these people, all these classmates of mine, line up to get In-N-Out burgers for their lunch. And they're lying around and around the fountain and back this way, back that way. I'm not standing in line for an hour to get some burger, these California people. And I marched off by myself to the dining hall where I eat my lunch by myself. And for me, it was a stupid thing, it was a little thing, but for me, that presence of that truck and then the fact that all these people lined up, it kind of triggered this anxiety that I had about what this community was like and whether I would be able to fit into it. All of us have different kinds of stories like that, stories of when we go to college or stories of when we go into workplaces where there's something that maybe we're not quite fully aware of, but that's making us unsure about what that world can be like and whether we're going to belong there. As a psychologist, when I think about people's experiences in school, I, in particular, think about the perspective that people have, the way that the world appears to a student. For example, a student who's sitting here in the third row of a classroom looking forward to their instructor, trying to figure out what that space is going to be like. And we've all been in that position, and when we're in that position, there are some pretty predictable kinds of worries, at a high level at least, that students can have. So one kind of worry is a worry about belonging. Is this a place in which I'll belong, a place in which I'll be respected and valued, a place in which I'll be able to build relationships, a place in which I'll be able to contribute in substantive and meaningful ways to the work of that environment. People can ask questions about ability. Is this something that I can do? Can I do this work? Am I going to be up to the challenge? If it's hard, does that mean that maybe I'm not smart enough to do it? And people can ask questions about whether it matters. If the work is boring or frustrating, is there a reason for me to do it? Is there a reason for me to stay engaged? Is this work relevant to who I am or who I want to be or what I want to do in the future? And one of the just absolutely fabulous, wonderful observations that's happened in social psychology and related fields in the past number of years is that targeted exercise to help students answer each of these questions and others in ways that are more adaptive rather than less adaptive can cause very significant and lasting change in students' educational trajectories. When we can give students experiences and ways of reflecting that help them to answer these questions positively, we can cause transformative change in people's educational journeys. And when people hear about this work, they sometimes have the view, well, that must be magic. If you could do something that lasted 15 minutes, if you could do something that lasted an hour, and it caused change in people's educational journeys, in their grades, in their achievement, in their retention in a demanding academic space that lasted months and years into the future, well, that must be magic. Spoiler alert, they're not magic. But one version of this critique is that they must be magic tricks. These aren't sort of real responses to the real problems that we have in education. And this is, in many ways, an easier version of the critique to respond to, because as we develop increasing evidence and increasingly clear understandings of how these interventions work, that idea can be put aside. But the second one, that's maybe more pernicious, is that this is the magic bullet that we've been waiting for. We have problems in education. We have problems with students not doing as well as we'd like them to do. We have problems with certain kinds of inequalities. These are the, whatever that was, I don't know what it was, but whatever that was, let's get that everywhere to everyone as soon as we can. Let's scale everything immediately without delay. And that's also a mistaken view, because what we really need to do is understand what these interventions are doing, how they're engaged with the ways that students are making sense of their experiences in classrooms, in schools, so as to improve their outcomes. Another way to think about this is through the lens of this metaphor. It sure seems like a miracle when something that weighs many, many tons, like the airplane that I flew on to get here, actually lifts off the ground and is hovering above the ground. It's an amazing, amazing thing. And if you start to think about it, there's a variety of different kinds of systems within this airplane that help it to achieve this miracle of flight. First of all, there's got to be somebody who's controlling it, who's making it do things, and we'll call that person the pilot. It also needs to be something that makes it go forward. It seems helpful to go forward if you want to be able to go up. We'll call that the engine. And then there's this weird shape, which also seems really important to be able to fly. And if you go to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., they have a very nice exhibit on the Wright brothers and how the Wright brothers started to learn how air flows over a blade. And they did that through iterative, essentially laboratory science and field science. So they spend time in the back room of their bicycle shop in Ohio with a wind tunnel, understanding how to shape a blade to maximize the force of lift. And then they took that to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, where they tested out different kinds of wings to try to develop the first heavier-than-air airplane that could lift off the ground. And similarly, in education, there are obvious features of educational systems that are necessary for them to succeed. And they're obvious, but they're not necessarily easy to accomplish. So we need to have opportunities for learning. We need to create schools and classrooms and spaces in which people have access to materials that they can learn from or experiences that they can learn from. We need to create communities of teachers and learners amongst learners that support that learning environment. We also need to have a basic kind of motivation on the part of all the people involved, the people creating these spaces, the teachers, the students, their parents, for students to be able to do well and succeed. But there's also less obvious features of educational systems, just like there are less obvious features of airplanes, like the shape of a wing, that can be essential to their success. And often these take the form of psychological processes that can prevent the system from functioning in the way that, in a sense, it was designed. So students come to school worried about fixed mindsets about intelligence, thinking that maybe they're dumb. If they come to school worried about stereotypes that mark them as different or deficient, and then therefore worried about whether they're going to be able to belong in that environment, then they may not be able to take up the learning opportunities that are available to them. They may not be able to go to office hours to talk with a professor about a problem that they're struggling with. They may have more difficulty reaching out to peers and building relationships with peers that could support them in a demanding academic environment. And what psychological interventions often do is they address these worries. They help take them off the table so that the system can function in the way that it's designed, so the system can function efficiently, so that the airplane can lift off. Okay, so today what I want to do is to focus on students' experiences of belonging in school. And in particular, a very important point I want to begin with is that these psychological barriers that are developing arise from the interpretations that people make of their experiences. So when people have an experience, like they get criticized in class, or they don't do well on a test, or they feel lonely, or they feel excluded, they make sense of that event. And when they make sense of that event, and then if they interpret that event as meaning that they don't belong in that environment, then that can be detrimental to their outcomes. Now, those interpretations that people draw, very importantly, come out of the particular sociocultural contexts in which people are trying to learn and go to school. That psychology comes out of history. And understanding that is, I think, really essential to then understanding how to create education systems that help take those deleterious psychological processes off the table. So this very important point then, these interpretations that individuals make of their experiences, interpretations like, maybe I don't belong here, or maybe I'm not smart enough here, come out of our sociocultural context. They're located in cultures, they're located in societies, and they're located in histories. And often, a particularly important aspect of that context involves the distinct perspectives or risks or contingencies that people have as a function of their personal or social identity. We don't all come to the same place from the same background. We don't all face the same kinds of risks and challenges. When one person comes in, they face a negative stereotype about their group. If their group has been underrepresented, if it's been marginalized within an educational setting, then that creates a different experience for them. That creates different kinds of risks that they face in that environment. They face legitimate risks of having other people view them through the lens of a negative stereotype that people who are in a majority group or a high status group simply do not have to contend with. I want to draw this out a little bit more. So the notion, for example, of intelligence was developed by the French psychologist Alfred Binet, who observed in the late 19th century that many kids were coming into Parisian schools from the countryside without having had a great deal of formal educational training. And what Binet said was, well, what we need to do is we need to figure out where these kids are, what these kids have learned, so that we can tailor our education system for them, so that we can connect them to the kinds of learning opportunities and resources that they need. And so he famously says, after the illness of a lack of opportunities for formal education, after the illness, the remedy, and the IQ test was originally designed, therefore, to identify those kids, to see what deficiencies had existed within their background, so as to connect them with resources that could help them learn. But when that idea of intelligence crossed the Atlantic Ocean came to the United States, and in particular came to Stanford in the guise of Louis Terman, it transformed radically. And Terman was not just a famous early psychologist and a proponent of IQ testing. He had a view of IQ testing that was very different from Binet's. He viewed intelligence as a fixed quality of individuals that came about from their genetic endowment that was more or less fixed over the life course. And that the purpose of IQ testing, therefore, was to figure out who were the smart people so as to connect them with the learning opportunities that would help them achieve the greatness that he envisioned. Not only was Terman had this radically fixed view of intelligence, he also was a eugenicist. And I want to show some of his words here to you. For me, these are very, very hard words to read. They violate many of the things that I hold dear, and I think that you may experience them similarly. But I think it's important to put them on the table and feel that together. So here he is writing in 1916, his measurement of intelligence. And he's talking about kids with low IQ. He says, children of this group should be segregated in special classes and given instruction which is concrete and practical. They cannot master, but they can often be made efficient workers, able to look out for themselves. There's no possibility at present of convincing society that they should not be allowed to reproduce, although from a eugenic point of view, they constitute a grave problem because of their unusually prolific breeding. So those ideas we don't commonly voice and repeat in society, but they echo in our culture, and they echo in people's experiences, especially people who come into settings where they're going to be viewed as lower in intelligence than others. In the United States, there's of course a particular distinct history as well of racial segregation in schooling. This is an image from the desegregation of a high school, Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in the 1950s and under court order. And you can imagine the feelings of, well, shall we say, non-belonging that she may be experiencing as she is not welcomed into this school. And those battles around segregation and desegregation of the courts and civil protest have continued generation upon generation within the United States. In the United States, that history then echoes, and it creates questions that individuals ask themselves as they come into settings. It leads people to approach those settings with questions like this. Am I the kind of person who can go to college and succeed in America? When people are aware of, when they know about the history of racial stereotypes and the exclusion of their group from educational opportunities, they reasonably wonder, as they go into school settings, whether somebody like them can belong and can succeed within that environment. Those questions echo when particular events happen. This was a story from 2018. This is at the University of Colorado, where a group of students was on a campus tour visiting the campus. And a couple of the kids who were visiting were Native American kids dressed in Native American garb. And a mother called the police and said, they don't belong. Investigate these kids, they don't belong. Just 5 days later, there was another story. This was at Yale University, where a graduate student, an African-American graduate student, was taking a nap in a common area late at night. And Yale campus police showed up and said to her, we need to make sure that you belong here. A history of racism, of eugenics, of racial stereotypes, of exclusion from educational opportunities echoes when people experience things like this and when they read about things like this. It makes them ask the question, is this an environment in which somebody like me can belong? This is Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor of the Supreme Court, who describes this experience of uncertainty about belonging in her own experience attending Princeton University. Here she is writing in her memoir, at Princeton I felt like a visitor laying in an alien land. I spent my years since Princeton at law school and in my various professional jobs, not feeling completely a part of the world I inhabit. Something that's very important here is that she's not asserting that she doesn't belong. She's instead describing an uncertainty about belonging, an up in the airness. She can't quite feel confident, feel sure that she belongs. She can't put that question aside. So what do people do then when they have these questions in their mind? They enter a context, they have these questions in their mind, and what they do is they try to figure out the answers to those questions. And they try to figure out the answers to those questions even through their daily experiences, even through maybe the silliest and littlest of daily experiences, like, for example, my getting a little peeved at the In-N-Out burger truck. Here is the former First Lady of the United States, Michelle Robinson. This is in Michelle as a college student. That's why I say Michelle Robinson. And she, a few years ago, as First Lady, spoke to a group of college students and university officials about her own experience coming to college as an African American, as a first-generation college student, and as a descendant of slaves. She says, when I first arrived at school as a first-generation college student, I didn't know anyone on campus except my brother. I didn't know how to pick the right classes or find the right buildings. I didn't even bring the right size sheets for my dorm room bed. I didn't realize those beds were so long. So I was a little overwhelmed and a little isolated. This is like an absolutely extraordinary quote. Like, here she is, at the time, perhaps the most widely admired woman in America. She has been professionally successful for decades. She's the First Lady, and she was a professionally successful lawyer for decades earlier. And she's recalling back to this experience that she had, long ago. And the experience that she's recalling is simply that she brought the wrong size sheets to her dorm room bed, that she didn't know that the beds were long and that she should have long sheets. It's like an errand. It's like a hassle, an errand to be accomplished decades previous, but she's recalling it because it pulled on the anxiety that she had, it pulled on the worry, the uncertainty that she had, that whether she, as a first-generation college student, could belong at a place like Princeton. So Jeff Cohen and I developed the term belonging uncertainty to try to describe this, and really the most important point about this term is that it's not a belief that you don't belong. It's an uncertainty about whether you belong in an environment that you value, an environment you aspire to belong in, but you're not sure. You can't be sure that you belong. And because you're not sure, you're attentive to and responsive to daily kinds of events, ups and downs, that might mean to you, might seem to help you answer that question. So we first tried to look at this through a very simple laboratory experiment, where what we did was we just brought college students in. This study was with African American and white American college students. And we asked them to list friends of theirs who would fit in well in a particular academic field. The particular field in this case was computer science, but that's not so important. Some people were asked to list 2 friends who would fit in well. For everybody, that task was really easy. People could list a couple people, and they proceeded along. Other people had to list 8 friends who would fit in well. In that particular time, in that particular group of people, this was difficult, and it was difficult for everybody. So people would have the experience of listing a few friends and who they thought would fit in well in computer science, and then they'd try to list some more, and they'd start to write down people who maybe weren't their friend, or they'd start to write down people who maybe they kind of knew wouldn't fit in so well in computer science, and they had to kind of push it, and it was a difficult experience. The question that our study was asking was, what meaning, if any, did people draw from the difficulty that they had listing 8 friends in computer science? The answer for white students was basically not much meaning at all. So this is a representative outcome, people's self-assessed potential to succeed in computer science. They're self-evaluating themselves on a percentile scale. You can see white students are, on average, valuing themselves just slightly below the 50th percentile mark in both conditions. When we look at African American students, both who were asked to list no friends and who were asked to list 2 friends, they're similarly fairly confident about their ability to succeed in computer science. They're, if anything, a little bit higher than white students. But when we asked them to list 8 friends, when they had that difficult experience, their sense of their potential to succeed in the field really plummeted. It went down to about 30th percentile on average. These African American students reported that they wouldn't belong in the field. They reported that they wouldn't be able to succeed in the field. When we gave them a peer recommendation task, when we gave them peers who expressed interest in potentially pursuing computer science as a major, and asked them whether to write a note to this peer to convey whether they thought this was a good idea or not, they became discouraging, particularly of a black peer and not of a white peer. So it's as though they interpreted the difficulty of listing 8 friends in computer science as meaning that both they and their group might not be able to succeed in that environment. So what do we do about that? How do we address that problem? How can we help people to make sense of their daily experiences in ways that can sustain their belonging? So the question really is, can we construct experiences for people that help them answer these kinds of pressing psychological questions? Questions like, could somebody like me belong? Can someone like me belong here? If something bad happens, does that mean that I don't belong? We give people experiences that help them answer those kinds of questions in ways that are productive and helpful for them and their efforts within that environment. And that was the original goal of the belonging intervention. What the belonging intervention does is it helps people go from thinking about belonging as a kind of fixed quality to thinking about belonging as a kind of process that develops over time. So people, especially laboring under the weight of stereotypes, can have a kind of yes-no mindset or belonging. Do I belong or not? Does this event mean that maybe I don't belong? And instead, we want to get people into a kind of process mindset where they understand that their experience of belonging in an environment takes time and effort to develop, and then to ask themselves the question, well, what can I do to develop my belonging as I go into this new space, this new school space, or say, this new workspace? And in order to provide that representation of belonging as a process that develops over time. We tell people stories, and then we give people tasks called saying is believing tasks in which they write their own story. And what the stories do is they all convey from different perspectives that it's normal to worry at first about whether you belong in a new school, but that gets better with time. Those stories are attributed to diverse students, and they have many different forms, but they all provide that basic idea. It's normal to worry at first about whether you belong, and it gets better with time. Here's a sample story. The student says, I love this school, I wouldn't trade my experiences here for anything. I've met some close friends, I've had some fantastic experiences, and I've certainly learned a lot. So they're affirming their positive relationship to the school. It's not just a story about how much they hate the school. Still, I think the transition to college is difficult, and it was for me. So they say the stories are best understood as parables, and you can kind of see that parabolic quality here. So they make the general statement, it is difficult, and then I'm going to be an example of that. My freshman year, I really didn't know what I was doing. I made a lot of casual friends at parties and other social settings, and I avoided interacting with professors in class and office hours, I think because I was intimidated by them. This particular story is written to really emphasize the worry about belonging within the core academic context of school. This is not about just having friends. It's not about just being popular. It's not about dating. It's about whether you can really belong within the core academic space of in this case, the university. It got a lot better once I chose a major I was excited about. I began to make close friends through classes and labs, and I started to get involved in research with one of my professors. I'm happier than I've ever been at the school. It's really rewarding for me to feel like I belong in the intellectual community here. So it affirms this process of growth that takes place over time, and the students' efforts that facilitate that process. Importantly, this story here is attributed to a senior white woman, a student who at this particular school, you might think from the outside, is the kind of person who would always feel like they belong, the kind of person who the institution was built for. And the story instead is designed to convey that everybody, literally everybody, can worry at first about whether you belong, and it gets better with time. Belonging is not just a problem for people who are underrepresented in the environment. The stories don't deny the reality that people can have different experiences on the basis of their race. In some cases, they affirm those differences. But they're also not stories. The intervention is not fundamentally a role model intervention. That is, it's not just a series of stories about people like you who encountered challenges and succeeded. It's largely a story about what the common experience is of an environment. And that takes the form of often these what we call counter-stereotypical stories. You haven't had the stereotype that white people would belong in this environment, and instead, we're telling a story about how she didn't feel like she could belong at first, but it got better with time. After the stories, people write essays that are asked, for example, how has this been true in your own experience in the transition to college? Please write us an essay so that we can share that essay with future students to help them in their transition to college. And this does lots of different things at once. It makes the experience active rather than passive. Students are encouraged to take the role of creators of an intervention for other people rather than as recipients of an intervention. So we avoid any kind of stigmatizing quality that people might experience if they thought that we were trying to intervene upon them, that they were in need of an intervention to support their belonging. Okay, so in the original trial at a highly selective college, we tracked students, we delivered the intervention in a 1-hour in-person experience in the first year, at the end of the first year. And then we tracked their outcomes through students' senior year of college. And what we see is that for African American students who are in the minority and face negative stereotypes in this space, those in the control condition show essentially what we should all find a very discouraging kind of flat line. This is their term-by-term grade point average, and they're not showing term-by-term progress or improvement in their grade point average. In the treatment condition, though, we do see that growth over time, step by step, term by term, as though each semester they're acquiring more resources, more psychological resources, more confidence in their belonging, more social resources, more support from peers, from instructors that support a positive trajectory over time. White students are showing slow growth in grades in both conditions over time with no difference by condition. Overall, the intervention delivered in the first year of college reduced, in this case, the black-white achievement gap by 50% from sophomore through senior year. But because the intervention is really having its effect on the trajectory of students over time, that difference is greatest senior year, where the reduction is about 80%. And because the intervention is addressing something that's important to people as their sense of belonging at their university, it also has a variety of other kinds of benefits. So it improves student self-reported health. People report going to the doctor less and being healthier at the end of college. And it also makes people report that they are happier at the end of college. Now, how could that work? How it works is by changing how people make sense of the stream of daily experiences that they face in coming to college. So this is a story from a black woman in our control condition back in the first year of the study. This is just the first week after the intervention. We asked people to complete daily diaries where they told us every day what good and bad things happened to them. And here's what she said one day. She said, everyone's going out without me, and they didn't consider me when making their plans. At times like this, I feel like I don't belong here and that I'm alienated. The intervention, when we looked carefully at what people said, the intervention had no effect. There are no differences between different groups of students in the first sentence. Everybody had experiences like this and a variety of other kinds of daily ups and downs. People are talking about, the weather was crappy, I didn't get an award that I deserved, I felt lonely, I felt homesick, I got dumped by my girlfriend. There's like the daily ups and downs of college that people are describing. What the intervention did affect, though, was the inference that people drew from those experiences. So the intervention prevented African American students in the treatment condition from drawing the global inference of non-belonging in response to these daily adversities. And that change in social construal, the change in how people are making sense of the stream of their daily experiences, statistically mediated the 3-year gain in GPA, for whatever that's worth, which is not that much. Because clearly, if people are improving in their grade point average over 3 full years, it's not just because of something that happened in the first week after an intervention back in their first year of college. And in fact, now, with many more studies, we have a much more, I think, complete understanding, at least at the conceptual level, of how an intervention like this could produce such lasting change. What you have in this model is that there's intersection between membership in a group that's disadvantaged in some way in a school context and underrepresented, faces negative stereotypes. And then there's challenges, daily challenges like critical feedback, low exam scores, feelings of loneliness that happen to people within that context. And if the student believes that that experience is not typical, it's not the commonplace thing to go through, then they can be liable to draw an interpretation like this. I or people like me don't belong, can't fit in, can't succeed at my college. And when people have that inference, when they start to feel like, I don't belong in general here, it's really hard to stay engaged with that environment. People start to pull back. They start to, they engage less with instructors. They study less. They are less likely to go out with friends, to choose to go out with friends. They start to withdraw from the environment. That undermines the quality of their relationships in the setting. And without those supports, they're less likely to do well. What the intervention does is it gives people a different belief system. It's common to go through challenges like this and overcome them. That facilitates a different interpretation of those daily events. And that helps people stay engaged, build better, stronger relationships that support their achievement. We can see this more clearly, this process of recursion more clearly as we track outcomes farther forward in time. Here, a team with Shannon Brady at Wake Forest, Shoshana Jarvis, and Jeff Cohen looked at those original participants in that original study and tracked them into their adult lives. So what we did was we looked at people who were on average at the age of 27, 7 to 9 years after they had participated, 3 to 5 years after they had graduated from college. And we looked at major barometers of kind of young adult thriving. Like, what does it mean to have a good life at the age of 27? One question was, how satisfied are people and how successful do people feel that they are in their careers at that point in their lives? And what you see is that for both European American and white American and African American students, graduates, not students anymore, they are reporting greater career satisfaction and success when they had received the intervention back in their first year of college. Did that success, did that professional success come at the cost to their well-being? It did not. So we also asked people about their life satisfaction, how much stress they experienced, their happiness. And particularly for African Americans, they're reporting greater life satisfaction, less stress, and greater happiness with the treatment back in their first year of college than without. So how is it possible that a 1-hour experience back in the first year of college could produce this kind of change at the age of 27? How is that possible? Well, one thing you might ask was, that big outcome that we just looked at, that improvement in GPA, is it because they did better in college? They did better in college, and that doing better in college translated into better outcomes as the end results? And the answer within this American context is a profound no. So GPA does not even predict those life outcomes within this sample of students in the United States. Instead, it seems to have to do with the kind of relationships that people form, particularly the kind of mentor relationships that people form. So we asked people, while you were an undergrad, did anyone associated with the school other than fellow undergrads have a special interest in you and your academic achievement? And people report, African Americans report greater likelihood of developing a mentor with the treatment than with the control condition. So you can see African Americans in the control condition, just 43% of them reported having developed a mentor in college, but that increased to 84% with the intervention. Then when we asked people, did that mentorship continue after college, if you did have that mentorship? And African Americans go from 4% reporting continued mentorship to 37% reporting continued mentorship after college. So that measure, a composite index of that mentorship, whether people had a mentor in college, whether that mentorship continued after college, mediates those long-term gains in career satisfaction and in life satisfaction for African Americans. Let's look at some of the students' words to see in more clarity what this really means. Here's a black student in the control condition who says, I wouldn't say I received any mentorship at the school, not for lack of interest from professors, but I didn't really seek it. Whereas in the treatment condition, a student says, the first semester of my freshman year was very difficult for me. I was struggling academically and didn't feel like I fit in. I was unhappy with my major. I began to spend more time speaking with my freshman counselor. We really bonded, and she helped me realize that I did belong to the school. Thanks to her, I was better able to connect with my peers and perform better academically. We've kept in touch ever since. And this one, I had a very deep relationship with my senior thesis advisor. One summer, while I was doing an internship in Greece in a field related to my studies, my mentor came to visit me all the way from the United States. Given his old age, and I wondered, is he 35? I think this is a true sign of how much he cared. He always took an interest in how I'm balancing academia and athletics and took an effort to get to know me personally. So what you have here is you have people, African American students, coming into college, coming into a selective, predominantly white university environment, aware of the history of marginalization and stereotypes that their group has faced in education and society in the United States, worried about whether they'll be able to belong in that setting. Those worries then lead to inferences about negative things that happen, ups and downs that happen within the first year of college. And those inferences ultimately prevent them from being able to build the kind of rich relationships, particularly mentor relationships, that students in this world need to be able to thrive and succeed in their adult lives following college. And all the intervention does is it gives people a different narrative for making sense of those daily challenges. That different narrative, though, helps them stay engaged, build those relationships, and then ultimately succeed at a higher rate. One way to think about this is that meanings are kind of like clay. They are malleable. At key times, we can change how people make sense of themselves and how they make sense of their social circumstances, but they can also become fixed. They can get baked into the structure of people's lives, in this case, baked into the structure of their network of relationships in university and beyond. Okay. So I want to extend from this in a couple of ways before we close. And the first is to say this is an intervention that began really thinking about the transition of African American students into a selective college environment, but can we adapt the intervention and understand people's experiences of belonging in part through the use of the intervention with other kinds of populations and contexts. And There's a number that we have looked at over the years, including women in male-dominated STEM fields, urban charter school graduates going to mostly low selectivity colleges and universities, racial minority and first-generation college students at a large public access institution, and racial minority students who are transitioning to middle school. And I thought I would talk briefly about these two examples, both of which involve quite different experiences of belonging, but draw on the same basic principles to improve outcomes. So this was a study that was carried out at the University of Waterloo in Canada, which is a leading technical and engineering university, sometimes called the MIT of Canada. And this was our research team. And we were particularly interested in this case in the experiences of women who are coming into this university, into the engineering school at this university, and coming into fields that are dominated numerically by men. So those are fields that have, on average, just 10% women. So if you're a woman and you're in one of these fields, you come into that space, you're taking a small class with 20 people, it's like you and one other woman within that class of 20. And what we did to begin this work was to undergo a long series of focus group conversations with senior women in engineering about their experiences. And those conversations led to targeted kind of changes to the intervention to make it appropriate for this context. So a first example of what we learned and then what we changed was that women reported feeling excluded from male peer groups. They told stories about how they felt like they weren't one of the guys. And when you're in a world in which 90% of the people in that space are the guys, to not be one of the guys was a threat to belonging. So what we tried to do then was through stories to acknowledge that experience, to mark that experience, not to try to pretend it didn't exist, but to describe it as not necessarily having to be a barrier to belonging within engineering. So we told a story in which a woman said she had had lunch with a group of guys from her program early on. Again, the study was in Canada, and the conversation topic had turned to hockey. And she said, I don't know anything about hockey, I don't like hockey, and I felt alienated, I felt like I didn't belong in that conversation. But then she says, later the conversation turned to what was a contemporarily popular TV show about engineering, which was called Monster Machines. And she said the conversation turned to Monster Machines, and we had a great time trading conversations about the different episodes. And then she says, I realized that even though I don't share their love of hockey, we're all interested in how things work, and that's why we're all engineers. So she affirms and she validates the experience that you could feel excluded from that conversation about hockey. But she puts bounds around it and says, that doesn't have to mean that I don't belong as an engineer, that I don't belong in engineering, that I can't connect with those same guys around engineering. A second experience that women reported was kind of like patterns of kind of sexist disrespect where men were from men. So women described trying to make a classy women in engineering calendar and then having a male professor make a sexist comment about it, and a female professor say that they should present themselves as engineers first, not as women first. And so what we thought for a long time about what to do with this, how to contend with this, and ultimately what we decided to do was to simply kind of seed alternative attributions for experiences that were ambiguous but could easily be coded as sexist. So we told a story about an experience that a student had that if the experience were had by a woman could feel like sexist disrespect, but that was a story told by a man. So the male student says, I was taking this class and there's some new material in it, it was really challenging, but I was excited to learn it. I went to the professor to ask a question, and he blew me off. It seemed like he thought I was dumb. So he sort of says what is the stereotype about women in engineering. It seemed like he thought I was dumb. But then I found that my other friends had a similar experience with him. It turned out he was just not a very good teacher. We learned to go to the TA. The TA was great. He really explained the material. I learned it. I've been able to use that on my job. I'm ultimately glad I took the class and learned that material. So we're not denying that sexism can exist, but we're marking that you could have experiences like this, and they could be due to things other than sexism. The primary outcome of this study was students' first year GPA in engineering. And what you see is that when women are enrolled in more gender diverse majors that have on average about a third women are doing fine. This is a Canadian grade point scale. 80 is what is the cutoff for honors, and 60 is the cutoff for getting kicked out of engineering. So you can see everybody's doing fairly fine here. And men are also doing fine in the male-dominated majors, but women in the male-dominated majors are not doing well. And the intervention eliminates that inequality in first-year engineering. We also have a lot of other data from the study, including data from women's daily experiences, in which, consistent with the prior study I described, women are making sense of daily events in less global and general and threatening, daily negative events in less global and general and threatening ways. I'm also not sharing with you a third condition in the study, a second intervention condition, that produced the same outcome effects but some different processes. But if you're interested, you can read the paper, or I can answer questions on it. A second aspect of the study, though, that was particularly important that echoes the mentor data was that we looked, in this case, not at mentorship, but at women's peer networks. And remember that women in these male-dominated majors are surrounded by 90% men in their classes. And when we looked at the control condition, we saw that male engineers represented, only, it's very illegible, only about 44% of women's friendship groups. In the treatment condition, though, that increased to 75%, more closely approximating the kind of social world that they were in, suggesting that they really are becoming more integrated within the social space that they are trying to learn in. Okay, the second new population that I wanted to share is from a new paper that it's just published on students' experiences in the transition to middle school. So here we're going to go back earlier in life to adolescence. And this is a large team that reflects the complicated nature of this particular project and the particular statistical demands that were involved in it. The lead author is Parker Boyer, who is an extraordinary statistician and thinker about social psychological processes over time. The work here, though, is really focused on a related but bit of a different problem, which is the problem of high levels of discipline problems within American middle and high schools. You can see this joke, where is everyone? They were all expelled. The problem of discipline is like a real problem in education, in American education. Students' perceptions of their teachers' ability to keep the class under control are one of the top 2 predictors of teachers' value-added scores. So the 2 best predictors of teachers' value-added scores are 1, whether they can keep the class under control, and 2, the level of rigor in their class. And so it's very important for teachers that they are able to maintain control of the class to keep the class learning. School suspensions, though, for students are a really strong predictor of major life outcomes, the so-called school-to-prison pipeline, and they have increased dramatically, and that tripled from 1974 to 2011. So in 2011-12, 3.5 million children in America received exclusionary discipline, suspension, or expulsion. 6% of kids get this every single year, and a third to half have this experience at least once in their K-12 years. That's 18 million days of schooling that are lost. And this burden of exclusionary discipline is deeply unequal. So it's a burden felt most greatly by students of color, especially African American students, especially African American boys, as well as by students with disabilities here. And it has coincided, this increase has coincided with a new kind of mindset about how we think about discipline in America, which is a zero tolerance mindset, a kind of perversion of behaviorist thinking, where the view is that what we need to do is we need to show kids that there's consequences for their actions, and when we show kids that there's consequences for their actions, they won't act up in the same way that they have been. So in thinking about this problem, together with Jason Akanafua, who is a professor at Berkeley now, Jennifer Eberhardt, we developed a model in which really the most important part of the model is that it fronts the teacher-student relationship and the recursive processes that can exist between teachers and students to undermine those relationships over time, especially when both parties are aware of negative stereotypes and that produce high levels of discipline. So consistent with the belonging intervention work that I described earlier, when kids from racially stigmatized backgrounds come into school, they can reasonably wonder, is this a place where I'll belong? If the teacher disciplines me, does that mean that she disrespects me? Does that mean she disrespects me in a kind of racist way? And that worry in a student's mind can lead to disengagement and negative behaviors with the peers and teachers. So when the student's worried about that, they may disengage, they may act out, they may act against the teacher. And then the teacher perceives that. She may be aware that it's really important for her to keep the class under control. And so she may worry, is this kid going to hinder my management of the class? Is this student a troublemaker? And she's doing that as she has been exposed to racial stereotypes about who are troublemakers. That may lead her to behave treat students from stigmatized backgrounds in harsher ways, and that may only exacerbate the kids' fears. That cycle is basically a relationship going down the tubes and a problem for both of those parties. Now, this is also the story of how I got kicked out of preschool. So here's my own experience with this in preschool. I came to the school, and I was worried about whether I didn't have any friends. I was new at the school. My parents had moved. They moved to California for a short period of time. And then I regularly broke the rules because I had to run after the other kids in my class. I'm 4 years old, and I had to run after the other kids who were friends with each other as they'd go somewhere else, and I have to run after them. But it turned out that the school had a rule, which was that you couldn't run even outside, so I was breaking the rules all the time. So I don't know what the teachers were thinking, but then I do know what they did, which is they got me in trouble, and I had to sit in the bleachers every single day with these teachers who I was growing to hate and hate and hate. So then I started to think of the teachers as really unjust, and the school is really wrong. So then I took the next step, which is that when prospective parents were touring the school, I started to tell them what I thought, because I thought that was the only moral thing to do. And I don't know what the teachers thought, but maybe they were worried about the bottom line, so then they couldn't. That's my experience. So one intervention that we did previously that I'm not going to go into detail on is an intervention. So an important part of this model here is that this is a cycle. It's a cycle of a relationship between teachers and students. And so very, very importantly, you could intervene upon this cycle either through teachers or through students. Okay? So in a previous work, Jason and Dave Panescu and I developed an intervention called empathic discipline that was designed to target teachers. I'm just going to show you that at a very high level, so you see what that is, but then we'll look at the student. So this idea of empathic discipline is that the goal is to get teachers out of this kind of zero tolerance, punitive mindset about misbehaving students and back into the kind of older, rich tradition of teaching in which your goal is to create a safe and positive relationship space with your student, especially when they have difficulty or struggle, to help them grow and improve from within that context. So you want to empathize with misbehaving students and understand where they're coming from and understand why they behave the way they have, even if that behavior or those ways of thinking are irrational. You want to prioritize sustaining positive relationships with your students and work to help them improve. It's not that you agree with the students or you share their view. It's not that you're not disciplining the student. It's not a kind of disciplined curriculum. This was tested in a field experiment with 5 schools and 3 school districts in the Bay Area of in the San Jose area. There were 31 middle school math teachers who were randomized to treatment versus control condition. There were about 1,600 students, mostly Latinx. It was an online intervention over 2 sessions where people read articles and stories from teachers and students about this empathic discipline idea, and then they wrote about how they themselves took an empathic approach to interacting with their students. One of the stories that teachers read was this. In middle school, this is attributed to a 7th grader, I didn't feel like I belonged. It seemed like the teachers always called on the other students, so I didn't pay attention in class, and sometimes I got in trouble. One day I got detention instead of just sitting there, and my teacher talked with me about what happened. He listened to me, and he told me he had trouble sometimes in middle school, but that it gets better. It felt good to know I had someone I could trust in school. So the student's not saying I didn't get detention. They're saying I did get detention, but the teacher actually listened to me and understood where I was coming from and was supportive of me. So teachers are reading this, and then we ask teachers, essentially, how do you do this in your own practice? When you have students who misbehave, how do you do this? One form of that was we asked teachers, how do you build positive relationships with your students? And they said things like this. I greet every student at the door with a smile every day, no matter what has occurred the day before. And this is my all-time favorite quote ever from a teacher. I never hold grudges. I try to remember that they're all the son or daughter of someone who loves them more than anything in the world. They are the light of someone's life. And it's like, as a parent, you're like, yeah, like that's the teacher I want. Like that's the kind of teacher I want, and I want that person interacting with my kid. Like if my kid misbehaved, I want that teacher there with them, right? So we give teachers an opportunity to be that person that they themselves want to be. The basic outcome here is suspension rates, and the basic finding here is that kids whose math teacher got the treatment versus control were 50% less likely to be suspended over the school year. And that effect was basically consistent across different demographic groups, including for Black and Latinx students, Black and Latinx boys, white and Asian boys, Black and Latinx girls. You can see white and Asian girls are not getting suspended. It's also consistent for the most at-risk group, which are the kids who previously had an experience with suspension. Okay, so that was trying to get to this cycle of relationships from teachers to understand and empower teachers' agency to improve those relationships. But the belonging intervention gives us an opportunity to think about that from students' perspective. Could we allay some of these worries and therefore improve the ways that students approach their teachers and ultimately improve the students' as well as their teachers' own outcomes over time? So this is a paper just published in JPSB, but these data go back a very long time because this paper has a very long assessment window. I'm going to just share the second study. This is 2 field experiments in this paper. This is just the second one. This was a middle-class public school in the northeastern United States, of about half Black and half white. And students were randomly assigned a condition in 6th grade. And then we tracked them through 12th grade. Here are some of the materials that they saw. So they are asked to read about a survey of 7th grade students. They get pictures of kids who are of 7th grade age, diverse kids. And the stories that we shared came from conversations with 7th grade students. And so here's the sort of facts that we gave them. Almost all 7th graders said they worried that they did not fit in or belong in 6th grade, but almost all 7th graders now say that they now know that they fit in and belong. And some of the stories, so they say, change to middle school can be tough. At first, I didn't feel like I fit in. I was shy and didn't know a lot of people, but then I saw that all the 6th graders were nervous. You just have to be brave and talk to the people around you. It took time, but I ended up making close friends. And the second one has this lovely kind of feeling of the knot in my stomach, which came straight from a student. I felt like I had a knot in my stomach my first few months. I was afraid to talk to teachers. I didn't know them, and the classes are harder. I worried that they thought I was dumb. But they believe in you, even when you get bad grades. They want to help you get better. They help you do better in the second quarter. Teachers are there for you. And then this one, middle school is scary at first, but it gets better. The school's big. You have to be more independent and change classes. I worried I wouldn't find my classes. I'd forget my locker combination. The teachers and staff care. Once I got lost, but the people I asked showed me the way. Again, these are really sort of parabolic stories. Even when I got in trouble or didn't do well in class, the teachers showed me respect. They're easy to talk to and listen to what you have to say. I have good friends now. I get along with my teachers, and I feel at home here. Then kids were asked to write their own responses to these prompts. Why do you think that this is? One kid says, and these are their original writings, they might think they're dumb and everyone will laugh at them. Why might students worry first about whether they belong? They might get lost and forget their locker combination. They're kind of repurposing what they've seen. Why do you think it gets better with time? Because their teachers respect you, because they now have really close friends. Okay. So here's the biggest, highest level outcome, which is students' average annual discipline citations, the average number of discipline citations they had per year from 6th grade through 12th grade. And you can see that those numbers are not differing by condition for white students or for black girls, but there's a really large reduction for black boys over this 7-year assessment period. That's a 65% reduction in their discipline citations, and it's a reduction in the inequality as compared to white boys of 87%. And one of the reasons why this paper was so complicated is it has taken us a long time to really understand how we achieved this, this outcome, and I want to show you that story. So what we did first was we distinguished between citations that involved the subjective judgment of teachers versus citations that didn't involve the subjective judgment of teachers. And so those that involve subjective judgment are things like citations for insubordination or defiance or disrespect, where it really is part and parcel of the teacher-student relationship. It's like how the student is perceived by the teacher. Whether that's because the teacher's biased or whether that's because the kid's acting out, we don't know. But it's a sign of, and probably a cause of, problems in the teacher-student relationship. Because if the student keeps getting labeled as, for example, defiant by their teacher, that's undermining of their experience of that relationship with that teacher. As compared to things like tardy, graffiti, theft, other such things. So what we did was we tracked these within grade over middle school. And this is just looking at black boys. And you see that black boys in the fall of 6th grade for both objective and subjective citations start off pretty low. And then the objective, don't ignore what I just said, which is incorrect, although it's correct, but you're not seeing it. So here we're just looking at the subjective citations. And you can see that they start off in both conditions with few subjective citations. But within the school year, in the control condition, those subjective citations are increasing, as though that relationship is getting worse. The effect of the intervention is to keep those subjective citations low. And then what happens when they start a new school year with new teachers in 7th grade? Well, they go back down. So they essentially have a kind of reset. So they come back down. They're a little bit elevated, but they come down. They come significantly down. But then what happens over 7th grade? Same thing. So they have 2 whole years of this, where within a year, they have these undermining relationships with their teachers. And the treatment is preventing both of those within year patterns. Then what happens in 8th grade? It doesn't go down. Like now that's where it is. And that just persists through 8th grade. So they have 2 whole years of this undermining toxic relationship going down to 2 with classroom teachers. They start off 8th grade and they are having problems. We don't see that within your pattern for objective citations. It's really the subjective citations that are driving this. It's suggesting that it's not something like the kids are just out of control or just acting out. It really is something about that teacher-student relationship. And then
sorry, these citations are coming from what the teachers say or what the students say?
So the citations are all coming from the teachers, right? So, because the teachers are giving the student a citation.
Okay.
And then they're saying, what is the citation for? It's insubordination, defiance, disrespect.
Okay.
So they're labels from the teacher, but we know that the teachers are blind to students' condition. So we know the intervention has gone to the students, and the teachers are responding to the student's behavior as manifest to the teacher. Okay. 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 So then, what about student psychology? So here we ask them questions that get at their belonging uncertainty. So when something bad happens, I feel like maybe I don't belong. And you see that there's an effect of the intervention by the end of 7th grade, which is the first post-intervention assessment. It reduces uncertainty about belonging, and that basically just stays constant through middle school. So it's not that their belonging uncertainty is changing. But then we ask them questions about their worry about being seen through the lens of negative stereotypes. And one item like this is, I worry other people will judge my racial group based on behavior or performance of other people of my race. There's a variety of these questions. And you can see this is only black boys. It's at that key point at the end of 7th grade, after they've had 2 years of this crap with their teachers, that they're starting to report elevated levels of stereotype threat. And that persists through the end of middle school. And then we look at their overall level of belonging, just like I feel like I belong here, and you see that the treatment helps it sustain, but the control condition, absent treatment, they're just declining over time. So they have 2 years of this bad cycle with their teachers, and then they infer that they're being viewed in stereotypical ways and their belonging is dropping over time. But if we had given them the belonging intervention to start, they wouldn't have gotten into that cycle with their teachers. Then if we just look at the trajectory through the end of high school, you can see that this is overall, this is ignoring the subjective-objective distinction. Overall citations have a large effect in 6th grade, and that effect proportionally is similar to what we see all the way through to 12th grade. There's a big decline at the transition to high school, but the basic treatment pattern remains. Okay. Another question that you could ask is, could we reach populations in mass? Can we go to larger scales? And there's trade-offs in this work between scaling, sample size and scaling impact that I think are important to underscore. So this comes about for a variety of reasons. So one is that when we deliver materials in ways that can reach large numbers of people, those may often be less impactful experiences than we deliver the same materials to smaller numbers of people. And so if you have a student one-on-one and you can work with that student one-on-one for, even if it's just an hour, but it's a concentrated full hour, that can be a very impactful, powerful experience. If you then go to some website that people have to go to and they're on that website, and they're on that website for 20 minutes, and they're half the time they're checking Facebook, it's not going to be the same. A second point is that as we go to larger populations, the materials may end up feeling more generic to students. So we can't tailor them quite as closely to what we know of. We can't reference, for example, monster machines if the population's never heard of monster machines. And a third point is that as we have more diverse contexts, there are more exogenous sources of influence on the outcomes. There are more other things going on in people's lives. There's a bigger pool of variance that our intervention is essentially competing against. And among that set of variants are particularly affordances that can allow a change in psychology to improve outcomes. So context may differ, even if across contexts you produce the same change as a function of the intervention in a psychological state. That psychological state may relate to outcomes differently in different contexts. So if I feel like I belong, but there are no mentors available for me to have a relationship with, or if I feel like I belong but my teachers are really unredeemably racist, then that change in my psychological state isn't going to produce a change in my outcomes. So in general, we then would expect that with larger sample sizes, we'll see smaller effect sizes. We looked at this originally through what we can think of as preparatory interventions. The idea was, could we give people helpful theories about challenges in the transition to college in advance? And one of the major reason to do this was really for the purpose of scaling. Because it's possible in many university contexts to reach entire cohorts of students through online materials in pre-enrollment processes, before people have actually come to class. And it's easier to do that than after they've come to class in many university contexts. We did this, have done this in many ways now. We did this in this original paper in 2016 in PNAS. We reported 3 different studies. And one of them is a selective private university. I'll just show you to illustrate the approach. Again, this is a large team of people in this project. We had 90% of incoming student body participate in our randomized controlled trial, about 1,600 students. We were particularly interested in those 416 who were Black, Latinx, Native, or white first-generation students, all of whom show lower levels of achievement in this space than others. So they were the people who faced disadvantage. They saw a link on the orientation website that they were all asked to pursue, and that link directed them to an online survey that had a control condition or one of 3 different interventions. There's 4 conditions in this particular study. There's the belonging intervention, and then there's 2 interventions that are modeled on the belonging intervention but surfaced slightly different themes. Their differences are not really so important for us right now. So people saw something like this. This was a social and academic life at Stanford. What's it like to come to Stanford? Then they went into the online module. You're in, you're coming, you're excited. You probably have lots of questions about what to expect. And then they got the randomized material. So here's the basic outcome, which is students' first year grades. And what we see is that if we look at students from advantaged backgrounds, we see no difference between the conditions. Everybody's doing well. If we look at the prior 2 years of students from disadvantaged backgrounds, they're doing less well. And our control condition is reproducing that less wellness, reproducing that relative inequality. But all of the interventions and their combination produce a significant increase in students' first-year grades that corresponds to about a 30% reduction in the raw achievement gap within this space. And that, importantly, very importantly, is an institution-wide effect. This is an institution-wide intervention that reached 90% of the incoming students. We also see a variety of measures that shouldn't be surprising to you now, because they reflect things we've already talked about. But people report with treatment making more close friends on campus, being more involved in student groups and extracurricular activities, taking advantage of support services more, like going to office hours more, and being more likely to develop a mentor relationship on campus. The finding that we could reach students en masse then leads to the question that harkens back to the engineering study, which is we really need to understand then when and for whom, which kinds of contexts is this intervention can be most effective. And the College Transition Collaborative, which is a center at Stanford, was created in part to pursue that opportunity and pursue that opportunity with many, many, many different colleges and universities. We have partnered with more than 20 post-secondary institutions. These schools are very diverse. They include small colleges in the United States. They include broader access public universities. These are universities that admit 70, 80, 90% of their applicants. More selective public universities, often the main public university in a state or in a region. And also selected private universities, as selected here as Yale and Cornell and Dartmouth. We worked with these schools over 2 different cohorts of understanding the belonging environment within each school and developing and implementing randomized interventions within each school. We ultimately ended up with an intent to treat sample of nearly 40,000 students, of whom we're particularly interested in these folks here for our treatment effects. These data are entirely, I'm not going to share the actual data from this trial because this is an entirely sort of mid-making point in time where we have done, these are exceptionally complicated analyses where you have students nested within schools and you have the trial as a whole and you have 2 cohorts and it's a very large sample. So I'm not going to actually show you numbers, but I'm going to show you some of the high-level points that I think that we are working towards, that where the story is developing towards. And so that's why I call this sort of overview of preliminary findings. So where is it that we see greater treatment gains? Our primary outcome here is first-year completion rates. Across these schools, the major problem in America is whether people actually complete their first year or complete college. And our primary population of interest are those minority and first-generation college students. So we see greater gains in contexts where students' local identity group experiences high levels of spring-term belonging in the control condition. Let me break that down a little bit. So your local identity group are the people who are like you, your race, ethnicity, your first-generation status at your college in your cohort. People like you, without treatment in the control condition, what's the level of belonging that people like you experienced in the spring term? And the idea here is that the belonging message is more true, essentially, when people like you can come to belong by the spring term within that college environment. And consistent with that, we find that the treatment effects are greater in those kinds of environments. That is, in environments where the context is amenable to the treatment message. The second thing, which seems a little bit contradictory, but in fact these moderators are uncorrelated, is that we get greater effects where people's local identity group has higher levels of inequality. That is, people with your local identity group, your race, ethnicity, your first-gen status at your college, in your cohort, have particularly lower levels of completing the first year of full-time enroll as compared to the comparison group, which is white continuing generation students. So it's in that circumstance where you see greater effects. So this is a world in which your group experiences inequality, yet can come to belong, is where we get the greatest effects. So there's a problem. That is, there's a problem here. There's maybe an experience of identity threat. There's a cue of identity threat in the inequality. And yet your group can come to belong, and that's where the intervention is seeming to be most effective. OK. So to conclude, students have really enormous untapped potential, and that's especially true. It's particularly true for students who come to school settings facing societal disadvantage. That potential that they have can be hidden by psychological concerns, like worries about belonging. Those worries come about as reasonable responses to sociocultural context, and yet they can shape the interpretations that people make of their social worlds. And in a really important way then, students' experience, their psychology, mediates the reproduction of inequality. We have an inequality in history, an inequality in our society that gets into people's heads. People are aware of that. They use that to make sense of the world that they face, and that meaning-making then can reproduce inequality in academic environments. What I'll call psychologically wise interventions are essentially ways to change how people interpret their world so as to change behaviors and relationships and then their lives. Really importantly, these interventions are, in a sense, engine oil. They're not the engine itself. They help systems work better. They help systems work the way that they were designed. And so they complement structural reforms. They complement efforts, for example, to make sure that students have learning opportunities before them. They don't replace those. And they depend, for their effectiveness, on affordances of the context. They address problems, psychological problems that arise within contexts, like fears about belonging, and yet they require a fertile soil for the change that they instigate to really take root and grow. Just to step back slightly then, this idea of psychologically wise interventions, these are not programs or skill building. They're not a new program or trying to build people's like self-control skill or their belonging skill, whatever that might mean. Instead, they really fundamentally address how people make sense of themselves and their circumstances. That's what they do. Sometimes we call this meanings or interpretations or narratives. And there's two reasons why these interpretations are so important. The first is that how we make sense of things, like how you make sense of yourself and your social circumstances, is the most important proximate driver of how you behave, right? You make sense of something in the world, and then you behave in accordance with that interpretation that you've drawn. And yet, those interpretations readily become recursive. If you fear that you don't belong, and then you don't reach out and engage with others, that makes you not belong. So in many, many ways, the interpretations people make can become recursive. They can produce behaviors that reconfirm the original meaning that gave rise to that behavior. And therefore, changing those interpretations can drive lasting change in people's lives. It's also not psychotherapy. So these therapy, very much like wise interventions, it tends to how people are making sense of matters. Psychotherapy is concerned with how people are interpreting themselves in the world. But therapy is traditionally understood as addressing personal problems or abnormalities. Instead, what we're really interested in when we do wise interventions is to treat the kind of common ills of social life, the common problems that we face as normal people in normal societal circumstances, to try to address those problems and help ourselves and others function better and flourish in our lives. Okay, I think I will stop there and look forward to your questions.